Good morning. I think it's 8 o'clock, and I know there's some other people coming who are probably caught in the rain. But we're going to get started to try to keep us on time because we have a lot to cover today. Welcome to this seminar on the new final rule that was issued by the Department of Labor on the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime exemptions. I'm Dorrie Larison. I'm in the employment group as well as our commercial financial services group, and I'm in the St. Cloud office, and I love the Fair Labor Standards Act, so that's why I'm standing in front of you.
And I am Matthew Webster. I'm based out of the Minneapolis office, also labor and employment and higher ed group participant, and I also am a lover of the FLSA and have had the pleasure of presenting with Dorrie and learning from her. So we're excited to be presenting this to you today. For those of you participating via webinar, we can see your questions. We'll be taking questions at the end, just given the amount of material we have for an hour worth. We're a little worried about time, but we'll take questions at the end, and we will see those as they kind of scroll through our computer. And then also for those of you who are here, feel free to follow up with us after. We'll stay here to chat with anybody. And then those of you via webinar, you can always feel free to give us a call at our offices or our email addresses, and those are all with the materials that you received today.
Great. So let's get started. As many of you know, we're here today because the Department of Labor issued the final rule on May 18th regarding the overtime exemptions for the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's put a lot of people into a panic, and Matthew and I are here today to say, don't panic. We have some time to plan. We have some time to work around this. It's not the best of situations, but we can deal with it. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a sense of how you want to attack these issues. By the way, you've probably been seeing that there's been a lot of legislation introduced to try to stop the rules from coming into effect. Our read is, don't rely on that, probably not going to happen. Okay, the number of people who've signed on to the legislation isn't sufficient. All kinds of things. President wouldn't sign it. So at least this year it's not going to happen, and we are going to be subject to the rules. Let's talk a little bit then about how we're going to approach this topic today. The first thing we want to do is give you a quick review, and many of you have heard this, particularly at our presentation at our employment law seminar this fall or this spring, but we want to give you a quick review of some of the basics of the Fair Labor Standards Act as they relate to the overtime exemption. We want to also talk to you about what the future is going to be under the new rules. So we'll be talking to you exactly what those rules say, the impact that we see that happening as to employers, but also on employees. You have to remember that there's going to be some impacts on employees that are often lost. And then finally, we're going to talk to you about what your options are and what your action steps should be to try to deal with these issues. So that's the plan for today, and hopefully we can help you deal with the issue clearly. So let's talk a little bit about the Fair Labor Standards Act as an overview. Most of you know the Fair Labor Standards Act, a federal statute, regulates overtime, minimum wage, child labor. It has certain reporting requirements, etc. Almost all employees are subject to it, but not all. One of the first things you need to understand, and something we rarely talk about, is are you even covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act? We rarely talk about it because so many employers and employees are covered. But now with this new rule coming into effect and the salaries having to be raised, we think it might be important for some organizations to do the analysis, am I covered? You're covered in two ways under the federal statute. One is called enterprise coverage, and the other is individual coverage. An enterprise that has more than $500,000 in annual receipts would be covered under the statute. Nonprofits may or may not be covered. So a nonprofit whose income is all from donations, etc., that income is not counted in the $500,000. But if you have a store or something like that, that income would be counted in the $500,000. Even if you're not covered under enterprise, and by the way, enterprise, some specific organizations, adult or medical facilities, schools for children, institutions that care for older adults, institutions of higher learning are specifically defined as enterprises. So when we ask that question, we're going to have to make sure you fit into that. But you may also be covered by being an individual employee, and this would impact nonprofits more than probably other businesses. If you interact with interstate commerce as an employee, you email people in other states, you do credit card transactions in other states, anything that has you working with somebody or something in another state, you may be covered under the Act because that individual works in interstate commerce. So you can see how broad the definition is. But in particular, if you're a nonprofit, we may want to be talking to you about whether the Act even applies to you, all right? If it doesn't, remember that the Minnesota Act may apply to you, which is a very different kind of statute in that it doesn't have overtime till 48 hours, et cetera. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Quick review then of the basics of the Fair Labor Standard Act. The presumption under the statute is always that an employee is covered and they are not exempt. So what happens in the statute is they set forth, here's the requirements, you have to pay overtime, you have to pay minimum wage. From that, the statute for overtime and actually for minimum wage will say these employees might be exempt from those provisions, but you have to meet those requirements in order to be exempt. And the presumption is you are non-exempt. All right? So that means you have to prove you fit into that exemption category. So for overtime purposes, the most common overtime exemptions are what we call the white-collar exemptions. We're going to walk through those. But they basically have three things you have to prove. One is that you meet the primary duty requirements in that statute, okay, that I do the kind of work that I'm required to do to fit into that exemption. One is that I'm paid on a salary basis, which Matthew's going to talk about a little bit later, and means some very specific type things. And one is that I'm paid a minimum salary per week, regardless of the amount of I work. That's the piece that's going to be changing under the new regulations, the minimum salary. The actual salary basis requirement and the primary duty requirements are not going to change. So right now, as you know, it's $455 a week is the minimum salary. If you're a highly compensated individual, it's $100,000 a year. That's what we're sitting now. That's the piece that's going to be changing for these white-collar exemptions. Let's do a really quick review then of what those white-collar exemptions are so that you understand which job categories might be impacted. And the first one we want to talk about is the administrative exemption. So in the administrative exemption, this is the one, by the way, that is the most abused by employers because they think everybody fits into the administrative exemption. Oh, they're an administrator, they must fit in here. No, most people don't meet the duties requirements, so let's talk about what they are. Current salary is $455 a week, regardless of the amount they work. That's the piece that's going to be changing. Their primary duty has to be office or non-manual work that's connected to the management or general business operations of the company. So I don't make the widgets. I may be the HR, I may be in HR, I may be in accounting, I may be in processing in some other way that relates to the general business of the firm. But here's the stickler. This person has to exercise discretion and independent judgment about matters of significance. Okay? So I have to have the ability to make a decision that's going to impact the company. If all I'm doing is processing data, if all I'm doing is following a guide that says if this, then that, I'm not exercising independent judgment and discretion, I don't fit into the administrative exemption. The next one that I want to talk about is the executive exemption, once again, that has the weekly salary requirement of $455. Executive's primary duty is the management of the business, or a department within the business, or a subdivision within the business. And think of management as you would every day, the kinds of things, there's a lot of things in the statute that say this is management, but the kinds of things you think about in terms of making decisions, except as you will see in the last requirement there, very particular, you have to have the ability to hire, fire, promote employees, or make significant recommendations that people pay attention to, okay? One of the tricky things about this exemption is you have to manage at least 2 or more full-time employees, or the equivalent of that, so it could be 3 or 4 part-time employees, however it works out their hours. But if you are only managing 2 or 3 people, sometimes you could lose the exemption because if somebody leaves and you don't have anybody there, you're no longer exempt. One of the things you need to remember is that you can move in and out of this exemption and actually some of the others because you should be analyzing these jobs every year or so. The example I give, when I was an attorney, when I started my job, there wasn't a computer sitting on my desk, okay? Now I can't imagine getting by without one, and it came onto my desk very quickly after I started, but your job changes over time, and that happens a lot, and people don't tend to reanalyze the job. The professional exemption, to be in the professional category, and by the way, there's some specific exemptions for lawyers, doctors, some specific professionals, but generally to be a professional, you have to be paid $4.55. Your work has to require advanced knowledge in a field of science or learning, okay? Usually we're going to say you need a 4-year degree. There are a few exceptions to that, where we've got somebody with tons of experience. We might be able to say they're a professional in this field. The other thing that you need to be careful of is it's not, oh, we prefer to have a 4-year degree. No, it requires a 4-year degree, so maybe a license or something similar to do the job. For instance, I can't be a lawyer unless I'm licensed to be a lawyer. So you need to be very careful about that. There's also a professional for the arts, and slightly different, so that one fits in if you have any art type of employees. There's an exemption for those who work with computers. This one has not been very helpful to people over the years for a couple of reasons. It does have the minimum $4.55, or you can pay them $27.63 an hour. I don't know how they came up with that, but they did. And the rule, by the way, the new rule does not impact the $27.63, so if you're paying them that, you're still going to be okay. But their primary duty is computer design, development, consulting. So this is not your help desk people. This is the people who are doing programming, who are designing the processes you work with, et cetera. It's a higher level, and so don't think because it says computer that you have everybody covered in your computer department. Finally, there is the highly compensated employees, and a highly compensated employee has been, since 2004, the last time these regulations were amended, paid at least $100,000 a year. A couple of quick things about that. They have to perform at least one or more of the exempt duties of those white-collar exemptions to fit into that category. It must be office or non-manual work. You have to have an agreement with them 1 year in advance that this is what you're going to do. A couple of nice things, at the end of the year, within 1 month after the year, if they didn't make the $100,000, and you can include bonuses and commissions, if they're at $97,000, you can, for 1 month after the year, make up the difference. So you're allowed to say, okay, I didn't make it, but I'm going to pay you the $100,000. So that's a quick review of the current exemptions, and now Matthew is going to talk to you about what's happening under the new rule and the impacts. Then I'll be back to talk to you about how we address these issues.
Thank you, Dorrie. All right, now we move to the part of the presentation that you probably all came here for, kind of the main event, what is changing? And I was talking with a few of the attendees beforehand that we had just the right weather today. It's dark and ominous. There was thunder from on high. So this is the part that has gotten the most press, this first change, but we will talk about a couple additional changes, some of which we didn't see coming. They were not in the proposed rule. But to begin with, the largest change is a doubling in the minimum weekly salary. So again, previously it was $4.55 a week, or about $23,000, and now it is going to $913 a week, and on an annual basis, that's a little more than $47,000. So again, that's the minimum weekly salary. Dorrie covered the primary duty and the salary basis; those are remaining the same. But this minimum weekly salary portion of the exempt analysis is changing significantly, and that goes into effect on December 1st. So again, we front-loaded this breakfast briefing to try to get you the information as soon as possible so that you have sufficient time to think about the options we'll discuss with you in dealing with this significant change. And then the second piece that has a significant change is the highly compensated employee exemption. Again, it was $100,000 a year. It's now jumping up to $134,000 on an annual basis. And again, that is the only portion of the analysis that is changing for the highly compensated employee. It seems a little like inside baseball to look at how the Department of Labor is reaching these numbers. But it is really important that they show their work, and I'll cover it in the next slide as to why that's important. But just so you know where they came up with these numbers, these weren't just picked out of the hat like the $27.63 an hour for the computer professional. There is some basis for these numbers. The employee minimum weekly salary amount, they derived that from looking at the lowest wage region in the United States, so the South. They looked at census records from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then they benchmarked it at 40% of the wages in that lowest wage region. And again, that's going to be important because this has an automatic adjustment piece to it starting in 2020, and we'll talk about that. But again, it's going to be predictable because it's based on information, and we'll know about a year in advance what it's going to be in those 3-year automatic adjustments. And then the highly compensated employee amount, this $134,000 annually, was derived by looking at the census records, the wages for the entire country, looking at that and then benchmarking it at 90% of the national wages. So as I said, it is going to be automatically adjusted starting in January 1st, 2020. And based, again, because they showed their work, they can kind of predict what it's likely going to be by 2020 based on both inflation but then also in general wage growth. And so again, these are not set in stone because it's tied to a certain calculus, but based on past wage growth, the projected minimum weekly salary amount is going to be $984 weekly in 2020, which works out to a little over $51,000. And you'll see the highly compensated employee salary is going up much more. And again, that's because it's at a higher benchmark. It's 90% of the national average, and that'll be over $147,000. Again, these aren't set in stone, but these are the projected growth based on past historic wage growth. So we covered the executive, administrative, professional, and highly compensated employee exemptions. Computer professionals are also impacted if you're not paying them at the $27.63 an hour. If you are, then you can continue about your business as you are. The $27.63 is higher, the higher salary amount than the minimum weekly salary, so that's not impacted. That's still available. But there are a lot of exemptions available to employers that are not impacted by this new final rule. One is outside sales employees. Their calculus is not impacted by this new final rule. Again, computer professionals, if you're paying them on an hourly basis, $27.63 an hour, then they're not impacted by the new final rule. As Dorrie said, there are specific exempt statuses for licensed professionals like lawyers or doctors. They're not impacted by this change in the minimum weekly salary amount. And retail employees who are paid on commission are not impacted by this. We'll note that these are not recognized by the Minnesota Fair Labor Standards Act, and so that's something you should talk to us about if you have. Generally, employers need to abide by the most generous, and so, you know, the Minnesota Fair Labor Standards Act applies, the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act applies, and it's really whatever's the most generous to the employees, the employer needs to abide by. So you do need to make sure that you are checking both. Again, today's presentation is primarily on the Fair Labor Standards Act, merely because the Minnesota Fair Labor Standards Act hasn't changed in a while, but it's also the overtime doesn't kick in until 48 hours. So today's analysis is really about the Fair Labor Standards Act, but it is important to know which exemptions apply and which ones don't if you're subject to the Minnesota Fair Labor Standards Act. Again, there's a host of exemptions that are potentially available, and just like Dorrie was saying, you should be re-examining your classifications on an annual basis or on a routine basis because things change. You should also be periodically re-examining exempt statuses. Sometimes employees might qualify for a couple exempt statuses. They might be exempt in a couple different pieces. That obviously would be really important here. If you had somebody who was potentially an executive but maybe another, now would be a good time to think about that other, because that might not be impacted by the final rule. And so you may not have to do these changes if you do a careful analysis of the exemptions. A couple of the big exemptions I want to focus on, religious exemptions would exempt you from the whole law. So again, you can talk to us about that. It's not like an FLSA exemption. It's a judicially created exemption, but there is this religious exemption to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The agricultural exemption, slightly different under Minnesota Fair Labor Standards Act, but that would be something that would not be impacted by the final rule. There are specific ones for certain industries, like an academic administrative exemption, not impacted by this. A lot of transportation exemptions, newsies, which is always fun. Seasonal
It just shows that the
jobs.
law is from 1930.
That's right, that's right. And then the last one I want to touch on is just volunteers. Obviously, they're not employees, but they're not going to be impacted by this as well. So again, there's kind of a host of different employment arrangements you have, different statuses that you can examine, and now is the time to do that. As Dorrie said, one of the three analyses you need to do in addition to the primary duty and the minimum weekly salary is the salary basis. And so you just want to touch on this just for one slide. All of these white-collar exemptions that we covered require that the individual be paid on a salary basis. And that essentially means that you can't make any deductions or reductions in their pay for variations in the quantity or the quality of work. To the extent you're deducting things from their pay, it starts to look like you're paying them on an hourly basis, right? Their pay is fluctuating significantly. It is no longer a salary basis, subject to a couple exceptions. You know, you can make reductions in their salary for personal leaves for one or more full days. Full day absences, if you have something in your handbook about that, can also be subject to reductions in pay without sacrificing that exempt status, that salary basis requirement. Infractions of major safety rules or suspensions of employees. Again, these are things that an employer can do without jeopardizing that salary basis and thereby jeopardizing the exempt status. In addition to the minimum weekly salary, which has gotten a lot of press, there was an unexpected change. For those of you who attended previous presentations by us, it's not that we didn't read the fine print. This just was not in the proposed rule. So this came as a surprise to all of us, but it is a really important piece for employers. It's an extra arrow to have in an employer's quiver. Based on the new final rule, employees' minimum weekly salaries can be composed of up to 10% bonuses, non-discretionary bonuses, commissions, or incentives. And again, this is the first time that this can count towards the minimum weekly salary amount. So don't be confused. Bonuses and commissions have always counted towards the hourly rate of pay. So in terms of calculating overtime pay, you always had to calculate that in. But you couldn't meet that basic minimum standard, the minimum weekly salary amount, with any amount of bonus. It just had to be salary. Now, you can, up to 10% of the minimum weekly salary. Again, non-discretionary bonuses, commissions, or incentives. Things which are not included are the same with calculating the hourly rate of pay. So discretionary bonuses, like a holiday bonus, it's not tied to any quantifiable piece. You know, it's not tied to safety or attendance or quotas. It's just a discretionary bonus, gifts, loan forgiveness, vacation pay, profit sharing. Those things cannot count towards any part of the minimum weekly salary amount. So that all sounds great. What's not to love about it? The problem is, because it's satisfying this minimum weekly salary amount, it actually has to be paid for that to meet the exemption. They actually need to receive that 10% of their pay. They actually need to be making the $913 a week. And that's going to be looked at on a quarterly basis. Whoops. It's going to be looked at on a quarterly basis. So annual bonuses, you're going to have to adjust how you pay those because it actually needs to be paid out on a quarterly basis. And again, the employees need to be making that. 10%, if they're right at the threshold, would be about $91 a week, which works out to a little over $1,000 a quarter, about $5,000 a year, can be derived from bonuses to meet this minimum weekly salary amount. But the individuals actually need to be making that. And so if you have something like a non-discretionary bonus and it's tied to performance and they don't hit it, then the employer is in this place, right? you either need to true up their pay and pay them this $1,000 in a quarter so that they don't lose the exemption, because again, they need to actually receive that bonus, or you give up the exempt status for that entire quarter and you need to go back and calculate their overtime. Obviously, that's going to be onerous. The employer is going to be faced with keeping records, so essentially having a duplicative timesheet arrangement for these employees that are kind of on the bubble where the bonus counts towards their pay. If the employer is not going to true up their minimum weekly salary at the end of each quarter, then they lose that exemption and you'll have to go back and calculate what their overtime would be and pay them that. Chances are truing up or paying them their overtime is going to be more than $1,000. So most employers are going to opt to just make it, pay them the amount that was a bonus. So again, the potential is not enough. One piece, and this is true with overtime as well, unauthorized overtime. Employers, if you have a non-discretionary bonus that is tied to performance, you still need to pay that amount or you lose that exempt status for that quarter. That doesn't mean, though, that you can't take kind of disciplinary or performance review action with that employee. If they're not hitting benchmarks, say they miss the bonus 3 quarters in a row, you need to be taking steps as an employer based on their performance, right? So again, it'll be a little tricky because you're going to pay them essentially the same amount as the bonus that they would have received had they met the benchmark, but simultaneously they can be on a performance improvement plan or something because they're not hitting those benchmarks. Obviously, that wouldn't apply for something like an attendance policy or something that's not a performance issue. But if it is tied to performance criteria, you're going to want to go down kind of both roads. It's much easier for the employer to just true it up so you don't lose that exemption for the quarter, but you also have the right to address performance issues as they arise.
Can I ask a quick question? So on your last slide, slide 15, it says what's not included is vacation.
Mm-hmm.
Here they you have on salary, but they also have the vacation and 3 weeks. Got this minimum salary. Is that what that's?
No, so the question is, on slide 15 I have up for everyone, the pieces which are not included in the minimum weekly salary amount. The question was whether, vacation pay, say 3 weeks of vacation or holiday pay, whether you have to deduct that. You don't deduct that, it just doesn't get added on top, right? So it's not, your pay plus 3 weeks of vacation. That 3 weeks of vacation, that's built in. Yep, good question. So we have some official numbers from the Department of Labor I just want to run through with you. We'll do these quickly, but the projected impact on employees, currently exempt employees, this is what the Department of Labor has forecast, that about 60% of employees are not going to be really impacted at all by this change because they don't work overtime. That to me is stunning because as your counsel, I would advise you, if they're never working overtime, why are they exempt, right? They might as well be non-exempt. It's much easier, and if they're never working overtime, the employer's not really getting anything in the exchange, and you're losing the ability to, know how much they're working so you can do really good productivity and efficiency analyses. You're losing that for not really any gain. But again, projected national impact is that 60% of currently exempt employees impacted by this final rule don't work any overtime, so there's going to be no change for them in transitioning from an exempt to a non-exempt hourly employee. About 20% occasionally work overtime, so if they are transitioned to non-exempt as a result of the final rule, they'll receive some overtime next year. And about 20% regularly work overtime, and obviously those are the individuals that employers are focused on here because that's going to be the biggest change. The Department of Labor estimates that the new final rule will impact about 7.4 million employers, and this is the part I love. It will take employers approximately 1 hour each to implement the new final rule. So for all of you who are here, this hour does not count towards your 1 hour requirement. This is a shared time. This is imaginary time. But you will now go forth and accomplish all of this in an hour. And I have a specific breakdown as to what that hour will entail. So these numbers are all based on these 7.4 million employers spending only an hour in implementing the new final rule. The estimated employer cost is a little shy of $600 million, and then the estimated shift, again, that the Department of Labor is forecasting is $1.48 billion, or almost $1.5 billion in shift from employers to employees as a result of this final rule. Again, this is the forecast of that 1 hour spent. Spend about half of that hour, 43%, getting familiar with the final rule. Hopefully everyone here can skip that part because, again, this hour doesn't count, but now you are all familiar with it. And then about a third of the time, a third of that hour, making needed adjustments, so transitioning individuals from exempt, hiring new employees. We'll talk about some of the things you can do. And then about 30% of that hour doing managerial costs or managerial things such as timekeeping, keeping track of overtime, recalculating hourly rate of pay, all of that stuff. Again, somewhat optimistic, I would say, having worked with this in the past, but you all have an hour to spend on this. And with that, we will transition into what you can do with this hour of time.
And I think it's going to take more than an hour. But I also think that the Department of Labor was thinking you're all just going to do the first option, which is raise everybody's wages to the $47,000 who don't need that, right? And then all you have to do is make a few little adjustments and you've got your 1 hour done. And that $1.48 billion is just going to shift from employers to employees. But of course, that's really not what's going to happen, I don't think. I'm going to give you several other options, and I think most employers are going to transfer people to non-exempt status, which is going to be one of the things we'll talk about. So your very first option, obviously, is to look at these employees and say, right now they're making $23,000 whatever under the statute. We're going to move them to $47,000. To those who are currently exempt, they're going to stay exempt. We're going to double check their duties because by the end of today, I'm going to tell you, you need to double check everything, okay? But we're going to just raise them to that level. That's an option, obviously. And if you have somebody who's really close, they're making $45,000, The second option is to reclassify employees to non-exempt status, okay? I think this is what most of you are going to do. We're going to talk a lot about this when we talk about your action items. And so right now I'm giving you the options, and later I'm going to tell you how you make these decisions, by the way. There are some disadvantages to employers to moving people to non-exempt status. I don't think the disadvantages are as strong as most employers think, all right? The number one thing is that you're going to lose some predictability because when you're paying somebody on an exempt status a salary, you know this is what they're going to be paid. When you're paying them overtime, you've got to manage their hours, right? If you're not managing their hours, you lose that predictability. On the other hand, if you treat somebody as non-exempt and you pay them correctly, well, I mean, there's a couple other things there. You're not going to be in violation of the Fair Labor Standard Act. You're not going to be subject to the penalties that happen when you make a wrong decision about making an exemption choice. And by the way, employers have done that historically many, many, many times. I'm often counseling people about how we're going to try to transition an employee to non-exempt status who really isn't exempt without really letting them know that, right? So that can happen. What that means, though, if you are going to reclassify them to non-exempt, you're going to have to take a number of steps. And the first one is you're going to have to learn to manage their workloads so that they're not working overtime, or budget in the overtime into your cost factors. You're going to maybe have to adjust schedules. People are going to have to get used to not working as much or different kinds of schedules. You may want to look at spreading the hours over newly non-exempt people, over switching things over so that different people have different tasks as you're doing that while you try to control what's happening there. You may actually remove duties from people or demote them, okay, to say, yep, you're not going to have that duty anymore because the way we're going to spread this, it makes more financial sense to spread these duties over people. One of the things I want to point out here, I'm going to point out a couple times, is if people are exempt right now and they have cell phones, or etc., they are often working from home, in the car, unfortunately, all kinds of places for you. They're answering emails, they're constantly on call, and if you reclassify, that's one of the conversations you're going to have with them, and that is you cannot work, you cannot answer those emails. And I've got employers who cut off their system, and I have other employers who've created spreadsheets that allow people to track that time when they're at home and just enter it in so that we know we are getting it and including it in the hours worked for the non-exempt employee. So reclassification is an option. You may want to think about adding employees, right? So I have somebody who's working 60 hours or 70 hours a week. Wow, maybe I should have 2 employees that are both non-exempt. They're not going to be working any overtime, right? So that's an option to think about as well, is adding an employee and spreading the work out. It may be cheaper than raising the salary or paying the overtime. And as I'll mention later, this becomes an accounting exercise, really, is looking at where the dollars are and how they fall.
Before we move slides, Dorrie talked about potentially removing duties from some employees as you demote them and move them to non-exempt. That also opens up an opportunity, right? If you're going to be raising someone's wages, now is a great time to add to their duties, right? This final rule, one thing that is often talked about is, all things being constant, you're just going to raise their pay. Well, all things don't need to remain constant, right? If you're going to give somebody a $10,000 promotion because of this, now is a great time to assign more duties to them. And again, you can take it from another person who you might be reclassifying as non-exempt. So again, you don't need to look at this employee by employee necessarily. You need to do that analysis, but you have certain duties that need to be done, and you can reshift those.
And we'll talk more about that when we get to the action items as well. Okay. Another option is to outsource work or hire independent contractors, right? A lot of employers don't like to think about this. Certainly the labor unions don't want you to think about this, but it's an option. I'm going to caution you on the independent contractor piece, by the way. Please do not take a current employee, call them an independent contractor, and have them do the exact same thing they're doing for you now. And believe it or not, employers do that. That person will not be an independent contractor. I'm sure that they will not fit into the category of an independent contractor. And you also need to know that the Department of Labor, one of their points of interest in the last couple of years is looking not just at classifications of exempt employees, but looking at whether you've improperly classified someone as an independent contractor. So they've been very careful about that, and I'm sure they're going to be looking at employers to be doing these kind of shifts right now. So that's another option. And then finally, for those of you who have employees that have very fluctuating work schedules, and this has been around for years, and it's not allowed in Minnesota. So if they work more than 48 hours, it's not going to apply. But if you have them in that 40 to 48 hour period, you may want to look at a fluctuating work week or a DOL plan. Basically, you have to have an employee that works regularly, has fluctuating hours. So some weeks less than 40 hours, some weeks more than 40 hours. So obviously we're going to have a pattern here and have to know this and be able to prove that that's where they're at, okay? If we have that, we can agree, and you should get this in writing, to pay them a fixed salary per week. It has to be at least the minimum wage, okay? So we pay them a fixed salary, so if they work less than 40 hours, they get the fixed salary. If they work more than 40 hours, they get the fixed salary. But if they work more than 40 hours, they do get an overtime split for the overtime pay, but it's their fixed salary divided by the number of hours they work divided by half times the overtime hours. It's a little bit cheaper than paying the overtime sometimes. It depends. If they're only working 10 hours, that might not work out in the odd week. But if you've got people that are working 30 hours and then they're working 80 hours, that might be a better deal. And so it's something to look at. You do have to guarantee it. Once again, that can't be below minimum wage. You cannot count bonuses and incentives in the salary. Commissions is up for grab. It's a little bit split, okay? So it's an option. So what we're telling you is you really need to be thinking about what all these options are. And now you're saying, well, how do we make that decision, right? This is the hard part. This is the work you have to do between now and December 1st. A couple of other points on reclassification before we move into those action items. I think when you reclassify, and this is kind of an action item, you need to be thinking about all of these things when you're making that decision on whether you're going to reclassify. One is the administrative cost of switching somebody from exempt to non-exempt, right? Now we got to track their time, et cetera. Most of you have employees who are non-exempt who are tracking their time, so getting them into the systems may not be that hard, but there's going to be a cost to you, and that's what the Department of Labor was estimating, right? There's going to be a cost to you to make that transition. Morale issues. This is the one I really want to talk about, okay? When I've talked to you in the past about transitioning exempt employees to non-exempt, where you've wrongly classified them, one of the things I've talked about is that most employees think exempt status is a special thing. Okay, I've made it. I'm an exempt employee now. I'm special. What it really means is they don't get paid overtime, okay? They get to work 60 hours a week and they don't get paid overtime. But they all think they're special. And in some ways they are, because it's the only way you can have flexibility in the state of Minnesota. That I can leave today from my doctor's appointment and I'm getting the same salary regardless, right? And so employees who want flexibility in particular like having exempt status. Once you move them to non-exempt status, they're going to not feel really good about that. So you've got to start thinking about your messaging now and about why you're doing it. Now, for the first time ever, we have a really legitimate reason to say to employees, it's not our fault. They changed the law. We have to do this, all right? But you really should be thinking about your messaging. A number of them are going to feel like they were demoted, and they may not have been.
And this could be somewhat softened if the individuals are making more money, right?
Right.
Right. If as a result of the reclassification they make a little more money,
right,
that might go a long way towards
Absolutely.
softening this morale issue. And on the upside, they can now wear blue collars and striped collars and dotted collars. I mean, they have a little more flexibility
right.
in their wear.
Obviously, there's going to be some internal inconsistencies because now you might have managers who make the $48,000, $47,000 who you're going to treat as exempt, and managers you have at $30,000 who kind of have similar duties who are treated as non-exempt, and they're going to look at each other. And it's going to be difficult for you to manage that, right? Who's our managers? Who's in charge? Now, the Fair Labor Standards Act has always created internal inconsistencies in many ways, but I think they're going to be worse. The fuzzy lines issue, too, is where do they fall? Am I a manager? Am I not a manager? Now, that's always been an issue as well, but I think it's going to be more prominent now because we're going to have these disparities between people.
And you may have some managers that are also non-exempt, right? They're the same status as their employees that they're managing just because of this new minimum weekly salary, which again could create somewhat fuzzy lines. You know, I used to be exempt and my employees that I managed were non-exempt. Now we're both non-exempt. So again, just some of the perspective and the way that employees might view this change.
I think there could be a large service impact. So think about your customers and your clients. How many of you answer an email at 8 o'clock at night to a customer? Right? How many of your managers do this? So if you're going to move them to non-exempt and you're going to try to control their time, you have got to think about the service impact on your customers and clients, and how are you going to cover that, right? How are you going to make sure that the answer gets to the client or customer right away? How are you going to make sure that at 11 o'clock at night we've got somebody covering this, but they're not working overtime? When the emergency happens and the boiler shuts down, is the manager going to be paid overtime for going in to make sure that everything's okay? So you also need to think about your customers and your clients and how these changes that you're going to potentially make will impact them, all right?
And this comes up with overtime as well, you know, and we talked about managing workloads and, you know, having authorized overtime. But if you push too strong on that, particularly those of you with shifts, right, there might be some things lost at the shift change. If you're requiring people to clock out and be done at a certain time, they're done. They can't work off the clock. And so you need to think about that because, again, you don't want that service impact. You don't want a lost half hour right? When one person's coming in and the next is coming in at the same time, you'd obviously need some overlap just to make sure that your customers and your clients are not impacted adversely by this change now from the exempt to the non-exempt.
And then finally, I think you're going to see an impact on employee growth options, in that they may not be able to be promoted as fast, et cetera. So let me give you some examples. You have someone who usually goes to the National Sales Conference who's now non-exempt. So you're going to have to pay them a lot more. Now, some travel time in a non-exempt situation doesn't get paid, but they may be putting in 10, 12-hour days at that event. Or a marketing event where they're meeting with clients at night or customers at night. This is all going to be paid time, and you're not used to paying it in addition to what you're paying them. And I suspect that what employers are going to do is manage that time and stop sending people to these things, or being very, very deliberate about making those choices. So I think that's an adverse impact on the employee, not getting those opportunities, right? Not being able to meet the people they need to meet or learn the things they need to learn because you're trying to restrict the hours that they have. I also think we'll see an impact on employees moving up into management positions, because I think what we're going to do is restrict that piece. If we're going to pay them that much, and we need them to be flexible, we need them to be available all the time, we're going to try to make those people who are there already do a lot more time, and your ability to move up within an organization is probably going to be impacted adversely if you are the employee on the other side. This may all sort itself out in 10 years, but we'll have to see how that impacts. All right, so now let's talk about what you're going to do. Very first thing is you have to go through and identify everybody in your organization who's exempt, who makes less than $47,000 a year, who fits into these white-collar categories, right? You need to know who they are. You need to know what their duties are so that you can be making decisions about whether I can move them into a different exempt classification, whether we can split this up, et cetera. So identify who they are and figure out what they do, okay? Now, that's a lot. I mean, that sounds easy, right? Oh, just go on the charts and go 47,000. That's the easy part. Figuring out what they do is not. And this is the thing we've asked you to do for years, which is to look at your classifications on a regular basis and actually talk to the employee and say, what do you do all day? How much time do you spend doing this? How much time do you spend doing that? Because that's going to help you make business decisions about where you may make adjustments within those classifications, within those jobs. Knowledge is power. From now until December 1st, you have the ability to audit their hours. You need to do this. I've argued for years, particularly those people that are exempt on the gray lines, where they're not really clearly exempt, but we think they're exempt, that you should be tracking their hours. And you should be doing it not to pay them overtime, not to worry about that, to make a business analysis about whether this job should be changed. If you are treating somebody as exempt and they're only working 30 hours every week, gee, you might want to come up with a visit. First of all, don't treat them as exempt, don't run the risk. But secondly, maybe they should be working 40 hours and giving you more time, right? Because you're paying them for what you think is a full-time job. You may have people who are working 80 hours a week. Wow, that's extreme. Maybe you should be splitting that into 2 jobs just to make them more productive, right? Without tracking that information, you've never been able to make that analysis, and now I think you're going to be forced to do that. So right now, you should go back and say, from now on, you guys are all tracking your time. Here's the Excel spreadsheet. Please show it to me. I want to know when you're gone, when you're here, when you're working at night. I need to know all of that. And that's because we may be making adjustments and moving people around.
And as Dorrie said, and we covered earlier, the Department of Labor estimates that about 60% of these employees who are currently exempt, which would be impacted by the final rule, don't work any overtime. So this is your chance to figure out if 60% of your workforce is not working more than 40 hours a week, and all of this time you've been treating them as an exempt employee. Oh, yeah. Somebody just pointed out there's lots of programs out there, Build Track, whatever, that track your time. And
And then that's true. You can just find one of those programs to track that. In fact, the Department of Labor, a couple of years ago, put one on their website so employees could track their time to prove to you when they're making the case that you treated them wrongly, that they were working these hours. So just go on the Department of Labor site. There's one out there. Okay. But what are you going to do with this information? That's really important. So now you've audited, you know how many times. If you're transferring somebody to the non-exempt status, this becomes an accounting exercise, right? The accounting exercise is how many hours did they average work, right? They average 50 hours over this period we've been looking at. What are they paid now? I'm going to divide that by their hours and calculate in the one half extra time for overtime, and that's going to be their hourly rate, probably, right? You can pay them the exact same amount, or very close, by making those calculations and restricting the amount of overtime they have. Now, a couple tricky things about that, obviously. This is a transition for the employees, so I think when you're talking to them, you need to tell them you're not going to make less. If we find at the end of a quarter, at the end of the year, you've been making less, we're going to bonus you, all right? Because we think this is how this is all going to fall down, how much overtime you're going to be working, et cetera. These are estimates, and we're basing it on that. But it really becomes an accounting exercise where you do that evaluation and you make your decisions about where your costs are and what's the best way to do that. Keep them exempt and move them up, pay them overtime because you need them to work 60 hours a week, divide out the piece.
And this is where the real heavy lifting comes in for your business decision. Again, as Dorrie said, you're not just taking what their salary is currently and dividing it by 52 and 40, right, to arrive at their hourly wage. If they're working 50 hours, it's 10 overtime hours a week. You need to build in that time as well. So they'll have a lower hourly wage. It has to be at least the minimum wage, but you have a huge amount of flexibility on what their hourly wage is. And then you know that overtime is 1.5 times. And so you can just do that math so that you can, kind of have a rough estimate that they'll be making the same amount.
So we also talked about changing job duties and job description. This is a perfect opportunity to look at your job description, okay? But if you're changing people's jobs to non-exempt, you're going to want to changing those. You can be taking duties off, because you're going to move them to non-exempt, you're going to shift duties. As Matthew said, one of the options, though, is to say, if I'm paying you more, here's what you got to do. And treat it more like this is a promotion versus I'm doing this because the rule says I have to do this, right? Let's get some good bang for a buck here, okay? Treat it more like a promotion. We're going to change your job. Here's your new job description. Here's what you're going to be doing. Here's what your new pay level is going to be. And for those employees that are really great employees who can handle that, that might be the best option for you, right? And so you need to be looking at those job descriptions and thinking about where your changes are. You going to remove duties? Are you going to add duties? You're certainly going to maybe say now your non-exempt person is exempt if you have that in the job description, okay? I think you also need to analyze your benefits. Where do they fall in? If I'm moving people's hours down or moving people's hours up, does that impact the benefits and my costs? Right? My costs in terms of making this change. Make sure you incorporate that in your analysis, the accounting analysis. In my estimation, this is primarily a bottom line dollar thing that you can work out. If you want to be that hardcore about it, it's just about the dollars. This is where we're moving things around. To me, there's also that morale piece, et cetera, that a good HR person is going to manage as well. But let's start here with the bottom line dollar. Let's understand where the costs are and what the changes are. Once we understand that, it's much easier for us to make the changes in the decision. Clearly, you're going to need to restrict overtime work. I think you need to look at all of your policies to see how they are written right now. Most of you probably have a policy that says you need permission to work overtime, right? And of course, you all pay them if they work overtime without permission, right? Nobody doesn't do that because you're required to pay them, and you discipline them for violating your policy. This might be a time to make it a little more bold, a little more upfront to point it out to people. But you might want to look at some other policies. For instance, you are not allowed to work from home. You will not have access to computer systems. We need to be thinking about that. We have for years. We have a lot of non-exempt employees who are doing those kinds of things. And the statute is very clear that if you suffer someone to permit them to work by suffering them to work, you're aware of it, you can get penalized for not paying them. And if they're on your computer system answering an email, you know, okay? So you know if I'm on my iPhone answering the computer, answering the email. If you have non-exempt employees do that, please be careful. But now, the mindset of your exempt employees who do that all the time is going to have to change. And you're going to have to counsel them through that.
So one piece that's been kind of a common thread throughout, we've given you what the final rule changes. We laid out what the FLSA is currently, what the minimum weekly salary is, what's being impacted. We've given you, your options as an employer and then these action steps. But one part that the Department of Labor has not built into that 1 hour, right, that they estimate is going to take employers is the messaging. And that's what all of you are masters at, right? You're master messengers. And you need to message this well. I mean, Dorrie's talked about a couple things here, but this should not just be we're giving you a promotion because we have to. We're changing you to non-exempt because you have to. There are obviously ways to put a positive spin on it and ways to just say this is what we have to do. That's going to have a direct correlation with the morale. It's going to have a direct correlation with the fuzzy lines between employees and employees not understanding. So again, this is really where you get to shine. And again, this is an opportunity to build morale. Again, it's something you have to do, maybe something you should have been doing already, revisiting these classifications, keeping track of hours, but it is a chance to promote a lot of people or, at least give them a job change that more accurately reflects what you thought they were doing all along. Right. So this is, we talked about this when the proposed rule came out. We've talked about it at the seminar, but we really want you to view this as an opportunity. Again, it's not an opportunity you can walk away from, but you need to seize it, and it is a good opportunity to maybe make some changes that have been a long time coming for your organization and something that you want to do anyways. You want employees' jobs to reflect what they're actually doing, their titles to reflect what they're actually doing, and this is a great chance to do that.
So how many of you read Who's Moved the Cheese, the book, right, about change? Yeah. A lot of organizations do that, which is change is hard. I'm one of those people. I just had my computer changed the other day. As some of my clients do attest to, I was struggling a bit for the first morning because it didn't look the way it always looked, right? So change is hard, and Matthew's absolutely right. This is an opportunity, particularly if you're in the HR and you've been saying for years, we really need to review these, okay? And it's an opportunity to change people you've wrongly classified, and it's an opportunity to really understand how these people work, what they do, and how much time they're doing it. I think if we look at it that way instead of this big panic, oh my, what's going to happen, we're all going to be a lot better off. And so with that, we'll open it up to some questions. Yes? About part-time? But she doesn't have to be exempt because she's part-time. So if you don't work 40 hours a week, more than 40 hours a week, this doesn't impact you at all. So it doesn't impact part-time employees unless every once in a while you have them fill in and work over 40 hours. You'd have to pay them overtime, right? All right, they would be non-exempt. They are non-exempt. This is kind of back to the how do we treat people and what do we think that this is a promotion. I make this much money, I must be exempt? No. So think about that. Yeah,
on that question, so you can't prorate the minimum weekly salary.
No.
So that individual would now be non-exempt. They probably should have been non-exempt all along. But you can't prorate that. So this $9.13 a week, you can't say, well, they're working 30 hours a week, we'll take 3/4 of that $9.13. That's not how this works. If they're working in a week, they need to be making that amount of money to meet that exempt minimum weekly salary requirement. Yes, Meg?
Yeah, I just wanted to
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Megan just pointed out, for those on the web, Megan just pointed out that you might want to document if you have this people doing the same duties, but one is exempt and one is non-exempt because of what they're paid, to document this person could be exempt, but we're not treating them as exempt because the salary range isn't there, okay? Because otherwise, when you're trying to prove that this is a valid exemption later on, they might argue, well, this person isn't exempt. And so make clear that the reason you're treating them as non-exempt is because you don't intend to pay them $47,000 a year. But the duties fall within. And
similar to that, I've been asked the question, have proposed maybe having that if they're going to know all those things about when they work, their time, and that being like 30 hours in the office, on to a lot of emails offline. Now that's considered so that you have those extra here, and also if they hit over the hour mark, how you're calculating their minutes, their hours rate versus calculation.
so another attorney from our office, Megan, just pointed out that it might be a good idea to have some kind of written document with the client. It may not be an agreement, but some kind of document that they can see, this is how you're going to be treated now. Here's the parameters of how you're going to work. Here's the parameters of how you're going to get paid. Here's how you're going to get paid. Almost like when you start a new employee and you sit them down and say, okay, here's your pay, you're a non-exempt employee, you got to punch the time clock, all those kinds of things. But on these transitional pieces, and this is just the good morale building piece as well, is educating your employees about how this is going to impact them. Yeah. So the question is, how does the annual salary impacted by things like unpaid leave, et cetera? As you recall, when Matthew talked about the salary basis, there's certain things you can take off, right? So if I'm gone for the entire week doing no work, you don't have to pay me, okay? If I'm gone for a full day for purely personal reasons, like I went to the Twins game, doing, once again, no work, you don't have to pay me. You can deduct from my salary. So under the salary basis requirement, there's certain deductions you can make, including the disciplinary for a major safety infraction. By the way, that's major. That's not something little. That's like smoking next to the gasoline tank. Okay. So there are deductions you can take, and if you're gone. The trick in today's world, though, is that they're not working at all, and if they're working on their cell phones or they're working at home on the computer, you have to pay them.
Yep. But yeah, just to that question as well, that $913 a week is really the gold standard. That the annual salary amount is really for your rule of thumb. You know, it's about $47,000, but they need to be making $913 a week actually each week. And then obviously if they have an unpaid suspension or they're out on an approved leave, that obviously can be deducted to the annual. But when they're working, they need to be making the $913 a week.
Okay.
So
did you check? Do we have any online questions?
We don't have any online questions.
Anybody? Oh, I have one here. So this is your moral question, all right? The question is, if I have somebody who's been misclassified and I'm now going to change them, how far do I look back? Do I just start from today moving forward paying them correctly, or do I go back? What you need to know, the first point is, you can be penalized for their unpaid wages under the statute back 2 years. So you have to pay it, plus a penalty of doubling that, by the way, back 2 years, or 3 years if it's willful. And usually willful means they've already written you up about this once before, or we've got documentation that you clearly made the decision to ignore it, right? But 2 years or 3 years. Now, when you transition people, I talk to my employers that this is their call. Most of them do not pay the back time. All right? Some do. Some make the decision to pay the back time. They calculate it out. They pay the back time. Not all do that. Just remember that from that day forward, you're going to hold your breath for 2 years. Each day goes off, and you won't lose that. So when you do change somebody who you've improperly classified, you're at risk, and your morals will come into place. One of the issues might be, however, that you have no idea how much overtime they work.
which again, you'd be tipping the employee off. Could you tell me about how many hours you worked, and we'll, true it up. There are a lot of incentives. So again, the most conservative would be to pay for that entire 2 years to make it right. But again, you'd be tipping the employee off. That's, again, why this is really an opportunity, because you have this outside influence on your reclassification decision. Obviously, we work with employers all the time who are reclassifying employees outside of a new final rule from the Department of Labor, and you need to be really careful about how you message that so that employees don't think, I've been misclassified for 2 years, I need X number of dollars for my overtime pay. This is a great opportunity for employers to do the right thing, and again, there is kind of this outside influence. We are up against our time. We want to honor your time. We will be here afterwards. Obviously, Dorrie and I are happy to field your questions. We also have both Megans from our group, Neil Goldsmith and Sam Deal as well, to answer your questions. We also just want to direct you to our blog, the Modern Workplace blog. I hope all of you are getting those. If you're not, please let us know so that you can get those.
ModernWorkplace.com if you're not.
Yeah, we post at least on a weekly basis, sometimes a couple times a week, and we did have a big FLSA fundamentals blog series covering a lot of this background information about exemptions, classifications, deductions. We will have a couple more entries as well. Again, kind of the nuts and bolts of what you need to know about the FLSA. And then we've also posted about this specifically, and there are links to the actual large document on the final rule, but then also some helpful resources. So feel free to do that, but also to follow up with us. I want to thank you all for coming despite the weather this morning. Thank you for making it out. Excited to talk to all of you afterwards, and thank you for everyone who participated via webinar.
Thanks.